Live from Nerve, this is Derailed Trains of Thought. Welcome to Derailed Trains of Thoughts, your premier podcast on storytelling. My name is Timothy Deal.
I am Nick Hayden.
Hello, Nick.
Hello. I'm a little freaked out with this place.
We're way deep underground right now.
Yeah.
There's some giant robots, I guess.
Yeah. I'm
They're
hoping
not
they're
quite
friendly.
like any other robots I've ever seen.
No.
I don't think we should get in them.
Earlier, I
soon.
saw like this guy walking by with sunglasses. I did not want to get in his way.
Yeah, and we walked down that one hallway, and there was like some like huge tanks of some weird liquid in there. I didn't want to look too closely.
No. I want to run away.
Yeah. So anyway, we're definitely somewhere secret that we probably shouldn't be.
Yes.
Thanks to the podcast again.
Hopefully, we're safe here.
I should think so. We seem to be far enough underground.
Nothing would ever come down here.
Yeah. No,
Yeah,
I can't imagine.
Okay.
Anyway, welcome, folks, to the year 2020.
We have flying cars and food replicators.
We do?
And at my house I do. You don't?
No.
Oh.
I don't know if I should be jealous or not.
Yeah. The flying cars, no, because it's a mess with air traffic control.
No, that's why we remember when we were in the Derailed Thoughts, we were talking with Kenny about the drone system.
Yeah.
That's the way to do it.
That's the way. Yes, that's
what
great.
we need, not the flying cars.
No.
But anyway, welcome to a new decade, Nick.
Yes, it's been pretty much like the last one so far.
Yeah. It feels very similar.
It's only been like 15 days, but.
How was your ski trip this year? I always feel like I have to ask you that in January.
It's a standard of the podcast. It was good. Actually, we probably did less skiing than normal, partly because we weren't on the hill and partly because we have so many,
a lot of people.
And so we all take turns, and I had fun, and the kids actually did more skiing than they had done before. They were like feeling comfortable doing it, and that was cool, going with Theo and Serenity.
Was there any natural snow at the time, or was it all just fake snow?
Well, I think it had snowed quite a bit earlier, and then they'd made snow. So I don't know what percentage was what, but it was above 32. It was like maybe 40, and we're skiing, and it was nice weather for it.
Oh, okay.
So it was good. And we had this nice, giant, beautiful house we all rented. It was a good time.
Fun stuff.
How about your Christmas festivities?
Well, it was nice. It would have been nicer if I didn't get sick at the end of it.
Oh, yeah. You
like
can plan that better next time.
Yeah. I mean, Janelle was in town, which was fantastic. But it was the night because we had to do, because of family obligation stuff, our main immediate family big get together was like the 27th. Okay. And it was like that evening when I started getting a really painful sore throat, and it lasted for like a week and a half. Like you just saw me Sunday, and I was still having the lingering effects of some bronchitis.
Yeah, there's a sidetrack in which you will have to edit out much coughing,
a lot of
and phlegm.
Hopefully, it comes out okay. I might wind up putting that out before this episode, just because I thought it might be a nice backup to what we're going to wind up talking about today.
That's true.
But we'll see what the timeline is like. But before, folks, we get into our story school, I just thought it might be nice to note today, on the day we were recording, we just found out a few hours ago that Christopher Tolkien passed away. Christopher Tolkien, of course, being the son of the great author J.R.R. Tolkien.
And very good keeper of his works and estate. And
a legacy. And without Christopher Tolkien, we would not have the Silmarillion.
Which is, I can't even imagine, the world without the Silmarillion.
He edited and caretook. Yeah. Tolkien should berate me for my use of language, but he managed his father's works and estate super well, and anyone who's a fan of Middle Earth owes him a lot.
Yes.
So and there's plenty of his works. I mean, some of those History of Middle Earth books that he's done, which are essentially just annotated versions of his father's stuff.
Yeah,
it's really detailed, and I've never really gotten into.
I don't know how he got through. I mean, just so much work. Like he put together the Children of Hurin and a Baron Luthien collection, or I guess the kind of history of the various versions.
Yeah, basically kind of elaborated. Well, I guess the Children of Hurin was sort of like he took a lot of his father's outline for stories that were in the Silmarillion.
And I think even drafts that were half done.
Oh, were they half draft? Okay.
My memory, it's been a while.
They expanded them into a novel format, which is great. And I know he did the same with Baron Luthien, which is, I think, one of Tolkien's great short stories.
Yeah.
And I understand just like as recently as like he must have been like 93 when he completed did one for the Fall of Gondolin.
Nice.
Which, yeah, apparently I need to look at those other two things now at some point. But he passed away today at the age of 95. So we'd like to dedicate this podcast to him because as huge fans of Middle Earth, we owe him
a lot.
Yeah, we owe him a lot. So thank you, Christopher. At this point, I would insert something very poetic if I wouldn't know.
The roads go ever on and on.
The roads go ever on and on beyond the glassy sea.
Yeah.
With that said, let's move on now into Story School. Okay, so I feel like this is a topic we've maybe danced around before. Certainly, I know you and I have complained about it before.
Yes.
Over the many years we've known each other. And that subject is over-analyzation.
Yes, never happens in anything nowadays. Most people are very conservative in their analyzation of their works. But in case you aren't, we thought we would berate you, not talk about some of the pitfalls, honestly, with things you like or really resonate with.
Yeah.
So
and obviously we analyze stories all the time, so it's not as if analyzation of stories is always a bad thing.
No, and my sisters especially would say I overanalyze everything I watch, but
but there's a fine line between enjoying something and really digging into something, and then going beyond what is really healthy for a story.
Yeah. So Tim, let's make, for the sake of this podcast, kind of our definition, what we think is kind of a solid, good analyzation of a work.
Anything that we say.
Oh, good. Done. Moving on. Basically, in a perfect world, and again, not that we always do this either, your analysis should be based in the work, in the context, in the author, and not only whatever you want to pull out of it. There's certain things that the work itself supports. And again, people will argue about what that is, but that's all within the purview of what we would call good analyzation.
Yeah, our podcasts, at least the two of us, I should say, are very much anti-death of the author, which if you're not familiar with that term, it's something that is sometimes used in English circles, English being like English majors, to say that the author doesn't really have any role in the work once it's done. Once it's done, whoever reads something can just basically mean whatever it means to them, find your truth, whatever that means. Yeah, we don't subscribe to that.
No. So that's kind of our baseline, so you can know where we're coming from. And I guess the different types of over-analyzation, one would be a lot of stories have applicability, meaning you can apply things from the books to other situations. And that's a valid thing to do. You read a response or think, oh, this resonates with me. It's just like what's happening nowadays. You watch Babylon 5, you're like, oh, that looks like history or what's going on in the news or, that sort of thing.
Uh-huh. And it's like, oh, look, they were dealing with racism in the 90s. We're still dealing with racism today.
Exactly. Like, oh, the news, they don't trust the news. Well, no. Anyway.
We don't trust the news either. Yeah.
Or, read 1984. The reason you read good books, watch good movies, because they are always applicable. The problem is when you make that you overdo it. Tolkien used to complain a little bit about, speaking of Tolkien, people would say, oh, the ring in Lord of the Rings means the atomic bomb, and it's all an allegory for World War II. And he's like, no. He's like, I was writing this before World War II, but because of the applicability of power, it applies maybe to the atomic bomb, but it's not.
It's not a one-for-one relationship. And some people would insist, well, of course, it has to be this.
It's this, and how dare you? And the problem is when you say it is this, then if that's the bomb, then the Shire is England or Mordor. I don't know what you do with it, but but when you pin something down that can't be supported and build everything from that, it becomes a sort of overanalyzation.
And this is what I was talking about, death of the author stuff. When you start substituting your truth, your interpretation as like the only possible way to interpret a work.
Yeah.
Especially when that is obviously contrary to what the author has said about his own work.
Yeah, and I've done stuff, Evangelion, crazy anti-religion, whatever. But you can bring religious things out of it because it's true about human nature, about the search for meaning, stuff like that, and you can make connections that resonate with me that I know the guy wasn't talking about.
Yeah.
Because good art has multiple layers and multiple ways to resonate. But to say, this is what it means is insane, especially if you have any context of
what the guy was
trying
going
to
through
say.
when he made it. And yeah. I mean, Christians can be just as guilty of this as secularists. When you like, this story is clearly an allegory for Christ's salvation, all this stuff. And it's like, well, you can pull a sermon illustration out of that as long as you're not trying to say this is definitely the hidden meaning behind this thing.
I guess that goes to hidden meaning is, I think, another version of over-analyzation. Where like, well, this is what everyone thinks it means, but if you look at these little connections, this is what it really means.
The conspiracy theorist version of analyzing stories. And to be fair, there's a certain amount of this that sometimes people just do this for fun.
Yeah.
And if you're just doing it for fun, I don't blame you too much. I feel like I've talked about Game Theory on which is a YouTube channel on the show before. I remember one video I enjoyed was like they were trying to figure out how much money Scrooge McDuck is actually worth.
Yeah.
And they were analyzing pictures of his money bin that shows how many feet deep it is of pure gold and stuff like that. That's fun. That's taking little clues that are on screen or in the comics or something, then kind of extrapolating some ridiculous picture out of that. If you go too far, though, I think for me it's where you like say, no, this really is what it is, and you're just pulling like really minor details and equating that with the truth. And like, it's not, maybe if you're having fun with it, but for me, it just starts to feel disrespectful at a certain level.
Yeah. And I think, again, to say, I think Christians do this sometimes, even with some obscure stuff in the Bible, like, oh, these are the hidden, and sometimes there are meanings from like culture that like, oh, we understand the Old Testament culture now, it makes more sense. But sometimes you're like, I don't think that's what it means. You like used one thing and it's spiritualized, they'll highly spiritualize things. Go ahead.
Or like, we'll analyze this one scripture. I've taken this scripture over here and this scripture over here and calculated that this means Jesus is coming back at such and such a date. I've cracked the code, the Omega code.
Yeah.
Where I'm like, yeah, but over here, Jesus said no one knows the day or the hour. So
the hidden meaning comes a lot from taking minor things and making them the major things. And some shows and some books, and I think shows lend to it more just because they tend to be a little more built on the fly. So there's more, but TV shows. But like, Lost people take all the little stuff like, oh, this must mean this and this must mean this and oh, that Hurley bird and
I forget about the Hurley bird.
But the problem is, in some shows want you to interpret stuff, and so it becomes like red herring palooza.
That's what Lost became.
But then people on the internet just like to do this. Like, here's how all the Pixar movies fit together. Like, it's fun because
that's a fun thing to do.
It's a fun thing, but like if you actually think the authors are doing that, I think you're giving almost way too much credit because they're just making movies as they come up with ideas.
Well, part of the problem with the internet is that some of the stuff becomes clickbait. I mean,
yes, there's a lot of that.
I mean, it's fun that Pixar has a lot of little Easter eggs. They reuse little assets from movie to movie.
Oh, yeah.
And they'll sneak characters in the background somewhere. But sometimes I know, like, I remember when I was following Brad Bird, director, on Twitter, or maybe it was Andrew Stanton, another Pixar director. They would just tweet a sigh when someone would be like texting him asking for where are all the Pixar Easter eggs? And like, can't we just talk about the story?
Yeah, exactly. Now, sometimes those weird, interesting, hidden, quote unquote, hidden connections, you can make good argument they're purposeful. Like, you sent me that one time, the guy who analyzed the prequels.
Oh. The circle theory, I think.
Yeah, which might not...
Or ring theory. Maybe it's ring theory.
Would you say that was over-analyzation or just pushing things that are actually there and he put more meaning to it than probably was...
That's tricky. I had thought about him because he had a really super interesting theory in terms of how the prequels sort of mirrored... This is before the sequel trilogy was even a thing. How each of the prequel movies mirrored one of the original trilogy movies and how they... And, I mean, there's background for it. George Lucas said himself that the movies are sort of like jazz or like poetry. They rhymed. I mean, he went into really great detail about all this stuff. I mean, the way he would compare contrast shots was fascinating. Like some of the composition of a shot in one movie was eerily similar to what it was in another movie where there were similar things going on. So yeah, that's tricky. It's one of those things where it's a fine line. And I remember reading it feeling like the guy was not, I think for me the key difference is the guy was not, he was presenting it as a theory, not as fact, not as gospel truth. And for me that makes one of the huge differences, where whether you describe your interpretation as just that, an interpretation, or you hold all things past, present, and future about a story in relation to this one idea about it.
And I think the temptation for overanalyzation comes because art being created, sometimes the author himself doesn't quite know what they're discovering too. Like some of these connections, some of these repetitions, some of these things are built out of the deep things of an artist that's very human. And then there'll be repetitions and meanings that they meant, but they were not planned in the sense that, like, it's not like they had a master plan and put it all together. It was just, they're a human being with certain things that keep resonating with them. Like, I'll find connections in Strin Fred that I didn't plan, but they just were because of the sorts of things I'm talking about, the sort of ways I think about the world. Sort of things that interest me. And I think sometimes viewers of movies, readers of books, read more of a master plan or things than was there, because there is actually this deep continuity there because of the artist being
drawing from the same well,
being
consistent
with himself and what he's wrestling through. And
that makes sense. And honestly, the ring theory, I hope I'm remembering the name of this Star Wars theory right, that may be what it was. It may just be that there was a continuity of Lucas's method of filmmaking.
And he might have said, like, I like this shot, I'm going to redo it, but he's not having a deep meaning behind it. He's just like, we're playing jazz. So I think there's the temptation for overanalyzation is very natural, just because we love finding meaning. Humans are meaning finding creatures. And sometimes we feel better the more meaning, it's that sort of like pleasure of being on the inside. The more meaning we can find, then we know it even better than other people.
It becomes a bit of intellectual pride going into having your own interpretation of it. No, that makes sense.
And speaking of intellectual pride, probably the worst and most egregious version of overanalyzation is when you're basically an academic and you can't read anything normal.
I remember when I've commented before about how I had to take some communication theory classes in college and even some in grad school, and was kind of kind of annoyed by it. But then there are certain things that I wound up learning, and I've kind of incorporated in my thinking about certain things later. But one side of academia that I've always felt, and probably one of the main things that kept me from pursuing like academia as a career, was kind of this feeling that the study of stories in academics kind of didn't have a large reach or purpose outside of academia.
It's like unless you find a new way to read the story, it's not worth writing about.
Well, and like, because what I remember specifically, like for one of my important senior papers, was having to fit my interpretation of a story within a theory of storytelling. Within, like, there's a certain like formula that you have to find. How does this fit into this formula? And it just seemed unnecessary. It felt like one of those things that, like, you need to know this in case you wind up pursuing a PhD in literature or something, because you'll need to know how to fit something within this model. Model, I think, is the word they use more often than formula. And the funny thing is, I feel like we've seen on the internet, on YouTube in particular, a lot of people who enjoy the study of film, the study of stories. We see a lot of video essays are a huge thing now that wasn't a thing on YouTube 10, even 5 years ago. I sometimes wonder if that is the remnants of people who took film studies classes but didn't want to go into writing papers like that. They just enjoy talking about movies, and we've just kind of dumped this model stuff kind of by the wayside. which honestly I think is probably more useful for the common film geek.
And I think sometimes the theory overtakes the story.
Yeah.
That like we are more concerned with how we talk about things and what we can finding new meanings than in like, hey, this is an enjoyable story. Obviously, some stories have multiple levels, especially the greatest of the ones in the Dostoevsky's and stuff. Oh yeah. So once upon a time, I had found this mocking version of Bible criticism when they like look at the Old Testament, like, oh, let's see all the different authors of Exodus and break it down and separate it. And it was called New Directions in Pooh Studies, as in Winnie the Pooh. And they analyzed Winnie the Pooh in this very Old Testament textual criticism way. And it's kind of genius. We'll have to leave
we should put a link in the show notes.
I don't know how much I can read this, but he talks about the different names Pooh are given. So that's the different authors and how they were interacted with each other and redacted. And it's ridiculous, and it's written with all these footnotes and everything, and it's amazingly dense and academic, and someone really knew what they were talking about.
Yeah. When you said put your, because you did an academic study of green eggs and ham
to pull out the deep theological meanings. Once upon a time, I think we did here on the podcast, we did the philosophy of Looney Tunes.
Oh, that's right. we went into great depth about, I think that's in episode 35, I want to say.
And some people probably actually do that for real.
Oh, yeah. We were being facetious.
Yeah.
Like making stuff up about Bugs Bunny being a Christ figure and Wile E. Coyote representing the frustration of fallen man and things like that.
And again, it works because there are certain universal things you can just connect, but at some point you just kind of, the emperor has no clothes.
I mean, yeah, certainly Looney Tunes characters have archetypes, but because everything falls within certain character types. But when you start extending, and this not just Looney Tunes, but like any story, you start overextending that to, you can just pull it to ridiculous levels when something's just meant to be a cartoon.
Yeah.
I mean, I think about...
You can't do that, Tim. I think it's supposed to be a feminist, socialist, postmodern critique of colonialism.
I mean, I've thought about this with going back to our Star Wars discussion and sidetrack.
Yeah.
With The Rise of Skywalker. The Rise of Skywalker feels to me like the same kind of movie that Return of the Jedi is.
Yeah.
It's meant to be really big, boisterous, like the child and the childlike can eat this stuff up.
It's supposed to just be an adventure movie, really.
Yeah. And there's a cynical way to say that where some people will say, you just turn your brain off and enjoy the ride. Star Wars is supposed to be silly. Don't worry about it. I wouldn't necessarily go that far because...
There's a certain amount of seriousness even to an adventure movie and things you should do.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's a difference, I think, between just kind of passively taking something in and actively listening to what a story is trying to be. Like, I think a big part of the problem with over-analyzation is that people are too eager to talk and not ready to listen. And sometimes people don't understand that listening is not necessarily a passive thing. Mm-hmm. Listening should be an active thing where you're actively seeking to understand what another person is trying to say without necessarily adding your own interpretation. I mean, I guess that's kind of what we've been saying the whole time.
Well, that's a good summary. Yeah, I like the listening aspect because, especially with the internet now, everyone wants to put their 2 cents in. Mm-hmm. Everyone wants to immediately watch a new movie and say everything they thought it should have been versus what is it trying to be?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think when I say that it's a great childlike atmosphere, like when Jesus talks about childlike faith, I think he means it in terms of like a kid will just absorb it. And somehow that there's a certain childlike attitude that just accepts things, and not like I don't mean to say in a naive way, but in a trusting way. Yeah. In a sense of like, okay, let's go with it. Yeah. And I think that's a healthy thing. Mm-hmm. And again, you shouldn't necessarily go into a Tarantino movie with a childlike attitude. You should need to be more discerning than that.
And then even with those like adventure movie, you can still then after the fact analyze, did it do what it was doing well? Was it things it was lazy about? Was it things that really worked? Was it, Mm-hmm. But though that's a normal analyzation versus like, some of the, back when, people want Rey to be like Obi-Wan's granddaughter. It's like, I'm trying to think, how do you even do that in a film without, Or like there were back when Lost was getting over, people were like, oh, here's all the answers. Like they'd had to write like an essay to explain how everything connected. Like, and how are you going to explain that visually?
How are you going to include all that information?
That's basically has nothing to do with the characters themselves. Mm-hmm. It's just your pet thing.
Right.
And yeah, it might be cool. It might be a cool reveal. It might be more clever there, but is it good story?
And that's kind of goes to the crux of it, doesn't it? Because as well versus our culture is on story, and other times I think people forget that not every story can be all things to all people. Mm-hmm. Like one of the neat things about Star Wars as a franchise is, as I've said recently, you can have a lot of different kinds of Star Wars stories. And, if you want something that's super detailed about all the nuts and bolts, well, go read a Timothy Zahn novel.
Yeah, exactly.
You're not going to find that in Star Wars. Like you don't need the vast details of where they mined all the materials for their vast Starfleet army.
I mean, original Star Wars, there's no reason to, like, how do they make this Death Star? Unless you have to support lots of more stuff. But the movie itself, no one cares.
Yeah.
And you shouldn't care. It's not meant to be a point of contention. The fact that the Emperor then makes a second Death Star is supposed to just be, all right, we're in that sort of movie.
Okay, that's what we do. We have to go with take this and then just get the ball running, and then we'll let some other authors fill in the details later.
Honestly, that's why everyone loved to begin with. Be like, wow, another Death Star. This is awesome. What, a super Star Destroyer? Man, not like
they've done that before.
I wish you could do the comic book guy's voice from Simpsons, like wow, but. And again, I know all the other stuff too, because I like both sides of it. I've read a lot of the books and stuff, but yeah. So one more thing about over-analyzation. I do think this kind of postmodern, like, even the authors don't have a meaning. They just want to kind of let it be interpreted by the reader, lends itself to this atmosphere of over-analyzation. I'm not, it's even more widespread where even the authors are like, I don't know. You guys just choose your own ending. Mm-hmm. And again, I think there's a place for that if you have this applicability and you want it to be. I guess it's sort of like when we talk about the more abstract you make a thing, the more you can read into it.
Oh, yeah.
And, I think there are possible reasons why an author might purposely leave it abstract in order for it to resonate, because the more specific you become, the less you can read into it.
Less room for imagination. Well, and even John Baylor sent us that George MacDonald quote a while back, where even George MacDonald, I think it was him.
Yeah, sounds right.
Thought that it was good for readers to be able to come to a fresh understanding of something that maybe even the author didn't even have in mind. So as long as that's not contrary to the work, for me, that's the big thing.
Yeah.
If something adds to the work, but is not contrary to the work, then I think it's a good new, fresh reading.
Yeah.
It.
Because I think there's certainly a lot of value in the reader response, and each story interacts with a person differently.
Mm-hmm. Well, and we've talked before about how in certain myths and stuff, some of those stories are very vague and leave the reader a lot, well, what was that all about?
Yeah.
So it's not just a recent innovation. There's some of the old stories that have that.
I don't know if I've mentioned the podcast before, but I've heard that like some of the Bible's written in this meditative, have I ever mentioned meditative form where it purposely doesn't make the connection so that you have to think about it and draw the conclusion. The problem is, what it means is that there is an actual answer, not whatever answer you come to is what you're supposed to come to. I think those are the differences sometimes, whether you leave it open so you can make, like, a person might leave it vague, but the connections are there to do the answer, and there is an answer is different than, well, whatever you come up with is good.
Yeah. Whatever you think is accurate is fine. Yeah. No, I think that is true.
At least in some context.
Yeah. I mean, it does depend on the context. I mean, Paul talks about there being room for disputable matters.
Yeah.
And that whatever one person decides about certain things. But then there's obviously other things that Paul will say, this is good, this is bad.
I mean, talking biblically, the author knew what he wanted to say.
Yeah, exactly. And I always find that fascinating that God did leave certain things to be ambiguous. Mm-hmm. I mean, he was very clear about certain things that are right and wrong, but there's other things he's like, I always find that interesting that even in the Bible, Paul says like, yeah, there's going to be some gray areas.
Yeah.
Which is fascinating to me.
Yeah. I think maybe that's just because we're each different people and that there are maybe in the debatable matters, not one size fits all.
That's
in the
true.
non-debatable manners, then you got the work to understand what is he saying here.
Right. So yeah, that's true.
All right. That's most of what I had covered because we wanted to talk about it partly because in the media saturated culture we're in, people are very loose with their, reading. They'll read politics, all kinds of stuff into stuff. They're like, I don't think that's there.
And my favorite, if you want to talk about good over-analyzation, I think the podcast trend of examining a movie a minute at a time or 2 minutes at a time. Because I listen to one that goes through Muppet movies 2 minutes at a time. And this is the only time I've listened to a podcast that's done this. But what's fun about it is you get to, and I know these movies well enough, I don't even have to be watching them. I know exactly what scenes I can picture in my head, what they're talking about. But you're basically getting to go over the film with a fine-tooth comb and enjoying all the little idiosyncrasies that come along with it. Like, oh, that was an interesting choice. I wonder why they did that. Or, think about what sort of puppetry trick was going on in this shot. And I think for most of these podcasts, I mean, maybe there's some podcasts that are analyzing movie that the podcasters hate.
Yeah.
But most of them seem to be about fans just delving into a movie that they love.
Yeah.
And really getting to enjoy every little piece of it. And I think that's the best kind of overanalyzation.
Yeah, that's more just not so much overanalyzation as just massive amount of analyzation. It doesn't seem like they're overdoing it in the sense that they're reading way too much into it. They're just
enjoying it.
They're micro-analyzing it.
And I guess the people who make extensive fan wikis about, thank you for you people who, that's very useful for anytime, for making Babylon 5
Yes.
a podcast about it and look up, well, when did so-and-so, oh, here it is.
That's just knowing your details.
That's being a true fan.
True fan, that's the only fans. No.
Not really. But it does enhance our enjoyment of stories and what's there.
Yeah.
Yes, it can. Again, I think overanalyzation, a lot of it really does come down to pride.
Yeah. All right.
Anyway, so that is our story school for today. We will now move on into soundtrack.
1, 2, 3, hit it!
For my soundtrack today, I decided to do something from Xenogears because it's a very dense, spiritually laden story that you can certainly overanalyze. Actually, my remix also has some Chrono Cross in, which if you listen to my rant about that one episode, can also be overanalyzed. It's a medley for those two called You Give Me Wings.
I think there's also one more in there.
Oh, there is Civilization 4 in this, which I know nothing about.
I don't know if that has a story at all, honestly.
No, just
it's
you
a world building.
people or something. Yeah.
Anyway,
But it's from Dwelling of Duels.
the website.
A website that does monthly contests.
Between composers.
Yeah, and usually it's live playing. It's not like electronic or anything.
Oh,
like that.
okay.
That's how it started. Maybe it's not that anymore.
Okay.
It tends to involve a lot more live instruments.
And this one is by...
Ivan Hastok. So it's very 80s. Enjoy.
And we're back.
We're back.
Hopefully you feel like you just got back from Hawkins, Indiana.
Yep, sounds good.
It's actually probably a cheerier place than where we're at
That's
now.
a little scary.
Yeah,
honestly.
believe it or not.
I remember this kid. He didn't.
Yeah,
He looked more messed up than
Yeah.
than those Hawking kids.
Yeah, no kidding. Which is saying a lot.
Yeah.
Anyway, on lighter notes, we have some listener feedback. So over on Derailed Trains of Thought.blogspot.com,
Which is our website.
Which is our website still.
We will do something in this decade.
I would like to say we got something new coming this year, but you never know. It's these things always seem to take longer than we think. But anyway, on our websites, we got comments from the ever lovely, ever graceful, ever musical Janelle Buford.
Oh, you know her, huh?
I do know her
Okay.
a little bit.
Good.
And she, on our last episode where we were talking about biblical adaptations, Janelle wanted to mention Frederick Buechner's, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, forgive me, Janelle, The Son of Laughter, and Walter Wagneren's The Book of God, Jesus, and Paul. So those are all novel adaptations.
Oh, nice.
And she was highly in favor of the Judges anime series.
Well, we'll kickstart it.
My sister, on the other hand, she texted me and she was like, "A Judges anime? Really?" It's like, sure, that'd be great.
It's as good as any way to read Judges.
But in all honesty, Janelle was telling me some more about, I think it was The Son of Laughter, which I think was about, if I remember right, maybe, forgive me if I'm getting this mixed up with one of these other ones, but she was telling me about how an author did a good job of getting in the mindset of the everyday people in some of these Bible stories that they were about.
And that's something you don't get from the Bible, which would be a good thing to get from an adaptation.
Yeah, like in one of them, there was talking about the Israelites and about how they were basically, people who had lived in Egypt from a city, basically, and then going from being a civilized city where you have food and water readily available to being out in the wilderness. Suddenly, all these people, these country people, were like, "Well, we need something to drink." And we berate the Israelites a lot for being constantly complaining, and they probably weren't doing it in the right spirit of intent, but would we really be that different in those circumstances?
Probably not, honestly.
Yeah. So anyway, thank you for those recommendations, Janelle. And I know there's a lot of other great biblical adaptation novels, and if we missed them, feel free to send those our way.
Yes.
All right. Well, with that, we don't want to spend a lot of time with listener feedback because this is time for our big annual Our Take
on Tales.
Specifically, we do our take on Tales more regularly, but specifically today, we wanted to do our annual book club review.
Dun, dun, dun. We have our No Pressure Book Club, where every, 2 months we pick a new book.
Our number of books for our yearly book club goes down every time, I feel like. But our participation is hanging in there, sort of.
I'm enjoying it.
That's good. Again, you've read all of these.
Yes, I make it a goal of mine. It's actually been a very nice collection of books over the last couple of years.
Fun. And I think this year we got a decent variety of stuff. I'm not sure if any of them went quite as deep as some years.
Maybe not quite as deep, but they were interesting.
Good. We'll start out with what's funny is this was the beginning of the year, but I actually just finally got around to finishing it myself. Thrawn, a Star Wars tie-in novel.
By Timothy Zahn, the first one he wrote for the new official canon, I believe.
Yes. And Thrawn is an important character for those of you who aren't Star Wars aficionados. Thrawn was a very important... Timothy Zahn wrote the original trilogy of books about Thrawn.
Which basically started the whole Star Wars publishing bonanza.
Back in the early 90s.
Yeah. And it was a great series.
It was a great series. And Timothy Zahn is probably still my favorite Star Wars author. He would go on to write several more. And I was never as devoted to the Star Wars novel extended universe as some people were, but I always enjoyed it when I got a chance to read one of his.
Yeah.
So when I initially heard about he was bringing Thrawn back into the new canon, different setting, more in between the prequel and the original trilogy era, I was pretty excited about it. But then I think I sort of started realizing what sort of story it was and very subconsciously started dragging my feet. And it took me a long time to get to it. because it is sort of an odd beast to have a whole book, because previously Thrawn was the antagonist.
Yeah.
This is a book where he's the protagonist.
Yeah,
and
which is interesting.
Which is odd because, he's an Imperial Grand Admiral. Well, at least in this book, he's working his way up the Imperial ranks. So it's kind of weird to be reading a story from an Imperial, the Empire's perspective.
Except like he really is a good guy. He feels like they're keeping order and he's not abusing power. And he's interesting because he's very tactical.
Yeah.
And almost like a Sherlock sort of guy.
He likes logically reading the whole situation. Even in the original books, one of his big things, and it's still a big character thing, was he would examine the art of a civilization that he was up against or investigating or what have you. So yeah, this book really does bring out the fact that, Thrawn is a weird fit into the Imperial Navy. Most obviously because he's an alien. He has blue skin and red eyes, and most of the Imperials are very xenophobic and just humans. So he was obviously an odd fit, but even just his demeanor and way of doing business was quite starkly different from the rest of the Imperials.
He's very competent, and he really believes that the best way to keep order is to have a strong presence. But he doesn't really want to like squeeze people down. He just wants keep order. Basically.
Yeah, he was always, he tried to spare life as much as possible, as opposed to Darth Vader, who would just kill anyone who's in his way.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. My favorite scene in the book, I think, was actually between him and not insurgent, the guy he was chasing throughout most of the book.
Yeah.
Because the guy basically asked him, why are you still with the Empire? Like, you obviously have a better moral code. You can see how it's corrupt. Why are you still with them?
Yeah.
And Thrawn's answer is interesting. His reasons are his own. In some ways, they talk throughout the book about how he, as brilliant as he is, he's not very good at politics.
No.
And you can sort of read into him sort of the intellectual who has this logical understanding of things and yet doesn't really understand how human nature works.
Yeah. And the other interesting thing, and this is just from a Star Wars fan point of view, is it adds this whole sort of like, so he has this whole race of people outside of the Republic that like the Emperor's interested in, and he's trying to keep secret. Mm-hmm. And it's going to come into play at some point, because so there's a second book which I did read, and that's largely about Thrawn and Darth Vader working together simultaneously, having flashbacks with when Anakin first met Thrawn. Mm-hmm. But then there's a third book which I've not read, but Zach has, and it's called
Treason,
I think, because his big struggle is he's sworn fealty to the Empire, but his people is really who he cares about.
Yeah. Well, and it sounds like
Chiss.
It sounds like he views the potential of some other greater evil outside the Outer Rim, the main Star Wars galaxy, that he's afraid of and thinks the Empire could be a great asset in helping protect against.
So there's some interesting stuff for the Star Wars universe as a whole that I don't know if is in someone's back pocket, I think, for future projects.
I wonder if in the later extended universe, there was a whole Yuzong Vong thing, which weird things happen out of that I only heard scuttlebutt about. I was not a fan of. But I don't know, it'd be, now that the Skywalker saga in the movies is more complete, I'd be more open to seeing what they do with that sort of storyline
with some from outside the Republic space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One other thing I'll touch on for this book I thought was interesting was there's a side story about Governor Price.
Yes.
About how she becomes a governor.
And she's very
intense
and conniving, resourceful.
Well, what was interesting for me in a way is that hers was kind of also this rise to power, except that her moral character degenerated the farther up she went, whereas Thrawn was kind of a stable force throughout.
It's a nice kind of contrast. It does. This feels very much like some of the other of the canon books I've read, like Tarkin and Catalyst. It's basically a character study. There's stuff happens, it's not like, but it's very character focused.
Yeah.
So, would you recommend people reading it?
Depends on what they thought about this conversation. This wasn't my favorite Timothy Zahn book. I think in some ways I like Thrawn more as an antagonist or as a side character as opposed to being the main focus, because I don't know, just some of the space combat stuff or the strategic stuff wasn't really my cup of tea. But if it interests you, check it out.
And just to add to that, I did enjoy him constantly one-upping everyone and the tactical. I'm always like, how is he gonna pull this one off? But yeah, I would say if you're a Star Wars guy and you haven't read it and you want to get into the books, it's not a bad one, I think, to kind of start with.
Sure. All right. The next book we had down was Sleep No More. I believe Greg suggested this one.
Yes, it's a collection of ghost stories.
Okay. Yeah, I never got to this book.
It was interesting. I've never read ghost stories, so I don't have anything to compare it to. And it was older. It was hard for me. I had to get it on like Kindle because
Was this an anthology?
anthology of like this, like a lot of short stories.
Multiple authors? Or
No,
all?
just the I can't remember the guy's name.
I'll look it up.
They're kind of old, and I think the most interesting thing in the book I read, what's his name?
P.D. James?
Yes.
Okay.
The most interesting thing, I think, was, and they made this point in the little intro, was that he didn't write ghost stories that were also like in spots you didn't always see it. Like there was this car race, this race up this hill, and there was all this description of engines and stuff, and there was this ghost story there, and he'd put in places you wouldn't always see, like some of this more like in factories and stuff like that. And they were interesting. I enjoyed it. It's not something I would necessarily read a lot of, just because nothing wrong with it. Just I guess didn't resonate as much with me. But I found it pretty fascinating. Just some of he was very good at detail and eliciting a sense of place and detail. And some of them were pretty creepy. Some of them I'm just like, okay. I felt like there needed to be more, or like some more explanation. There were a lot of just sort of like I don't know how to explain. Hey, the car one. This guy had a dream about a crash, and then it happens the next day, sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
They were like unexplained, and they were very much like sometimes just weird stuff happens. Like there's this train, and there's this tunnel, and there's all this sulfur smoke comes out, and something happens. But like sometimes they're just like there's no explanation at all. It's just like weird incident, and just make you feel a little off. And so it was like a style I'd never read before, and some of them I really enjoyed, and some of them I'm like, I need a little more. Mm-hmm. But the good one, there's about 2 or 3 that I really enjoyed. I can't remember offhand because it's been most of a year now.
Okay.
But
So it sounds like that one was more about atmosphere.
it was very atmospheric.
Okay.
And like the history, the sense of place and atmosphere he did very well. Yes. So like if you want to read kind of vintage ghost stories, I'd read it, but I don't know how, I don't know anything else to compare it to.
Okay. So Sleep No More by P.D. James.
Yes.
Okay. Well, the next we had The Lightning Thief, which this is the first book of the Percy Jackson series.
Which I had never read.
And I never had either, surprisingly. I had seen the movie, the first Percy Jackson movie,
Which is not great.
long time ago. It's not horrible,
No,
though, honestly.
no, it's just,
I've seen a lot worse book adaptations.
no, just sort of there.
just sort of there.
Yeah.
That's fair.
And this came right after my son was like loving, like, Dad, you have to read these books. And it's like, oh, good, I have to read this book now.
I remember the thing that surprised me, or one thing that surprised me, the tone seemed to shift a lot from what I remember. 'Cause if you don't know what Percy Jackson is, he's the son of Zeus. No, take that.
Poseidon.
Thank you. He's the son of Poseidon, and basically it's sort of like Harry Potter with Greek gods.
Mythology, yeah.
Yeah, like he goes to a school that is filled with other demigods, basically the human offspring of Greek gods.
Yeah.
Except this is all set in modern America. Mm-hmm. Because apparently the Greeks travel to wherever is the seats of human, I don't remember what the details are, human power, human freedom?
Western
Civilization,
ideal.
Western
Yeah.
ideal. Okay. So anyway, which is America now.
Yeah.
There's ongoing struggles between Hades and
Poseidon
it's
and
this other
and
conspiracy
Zeus.
with the gods going
Someone
on.
stole the lightning.
Yeah, someone stole Zeus's lightning, and so they have to go retrieve it and all this stuff. And when I say the tones kind of shifted, like an early book, like Percy he kind of comes off as like a Dickens, like Oliver Twist sort of
Yeah.
like he's constantly the odd man out in this world that doesn't make sense around him until he understands where he comes from. But then later in the book, it gets much more like lighthearted, goofy as he goes through his adventures, and he has this kind of this sardonic take. Percy has a kind of it's first person.
Yeah.
He has a funny take on the things that are going around him. But then you also get like these really dark times when they actually go into the underworld, and like which is really pretty dark and depressing for
Or
a
like
kid's book.
his stepdad is like just horrible.
Yeah.
I mean, like it is kind of like I enjoyed the book, but simultaneously, and again, partly because it's not made for me. It's like
it's a young adult
it
novel.
moves very fast, and I always wanted like sink into something, and it just like
I enjoyed
Yeah.
it very much felt like along the quest sort of nature.
It was a good quest sort of book and really clever use of mythology.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's what it's known for more than anything. I
mythology
think.
in a modern setting. Like,
Yeah, and-
how do you adapt these ideas to a modern?
And that's pretty interesting.
that's fun. Like Ares is this biker dude.
Yeah.
I remember a scene from the movie I thought they did particularly decently was the stuff with the Medusa.
Yeah.
And with the garden. I think Uma Thurman played the Medusa.
Yeah.
Of course, the movie they cast all the characters as like teenagers, whereas here they feel much more like 12-year-olds.
Yeah, I think they're about that age. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a Hollywood thing to do.
Yeah.
It's easier to cast young adults as teenagers.
So I enjoyed it. I wasn't like, oh, I gotta go read the next one, right? Or anything.
I kind of felt the same way. I thought it was fun, but yeah, I didn't feel like I was ready to dive into the whole series. So then after that, we had A Wind in the Door.
I really enjoyed A Wind in the Door. I know you had conflicted responses to this.
This was a weird book. That was my initial impression.
See, it was a weird book, but like it was one of the books that like I got hooked reading. I just kept wanting to read it. Like this sort of weird book works for me.
So A Wind in the Door, if you're not familiar, is by Madame L'Engle. I guess we didn't say who Percy Jack Lightning Thief was. That's
Rick Riordan.
Thank you. Anyway, moving on. A Wind in the Door is a sequel to A Wrinkle in Time,
Which is also a weird book, but not as weird.
not as weird. I loved A Wrinkle in Time because for me it was a great fantasy / sci-fi, a weird mix of those two things. But that's what it is from a Christian perspective, and we don't get enough good Christian stories like that.
No, especially science fiction.
Especially science fiction, and I could really identify with a lot of it. This one, okay, first off, there's hardly any mention in this. It's a sequel to A Wrinkle in Time, but there's hardly any mention to anything that happens in that one.
I don't know if that's just
Her style, or maybe that's just our current expectations of if you're going to
I
do a
don't know.
series, you're going to build off each other. And it just seemed weird that
it's very much a standalone book.
yeah, and just odd to me from a character's perspective that they wouldn't be trying to associate these new weird things going on to the past weird things that they went through. So anyway, there's that. But then this one is the first 3/4 of the book is kind of exposition.
It really is.
Because it deals with, if A Wrinkle in Time was kind of a going into outer space fantasy sort of book, this one is going into an inner space, like down to the cellular level.
And cherubim.
Yeah, with cherubim
And doubles.
and demons,
Yeah.
and it's odd.
Yeah, it is a book that only... It's actually amazingly... that the fact that it exists is an amazing thing.
Like you have to have the exposition of the first 3/4 of the book for the last fourth to make any sense.
Yeah.
with all the trying to explain.
Kything and the Farandolas. And
Which I actually had to look up. Is this an actual thing or is this something that they made up? I wasn't sure.
And it's weird because there's all this science stuff and then just made up science in the middle of it. And it's like, wait, what?
What does this mean? And how does this fit in? And
So I guess I was fascinated just because partly it is so boldly whatever it wants to be. And the fact that there's cherubim and 3 of the boring principle and this Kai thing, which is kind of like psychic linking, but kind of deeper than that. And I don't know, it's like you said, it's a weird thing, but it's a sort of weird that I'm this is great. No, a second Death Star, I'll take it. that sort of thing for me. Ooh, more craziness. So it works for me, but I completely understand that it wouldn't for everyone.
yeah, I don't know. Maybe, obviously, I've enjoyed Doctor Who in the height of its weirdness. I think because I was expecting something a little bit more grounded that I didn't know what to make of it. And honestly, some of the things, and I still don't really understand what she was saying in terms of Christian truth.
Yeah. Now, as far as, it does seem it did seem a little more timey-wimey. But Christian truth, it does seem to really push this sort of we're all interconnected and helping, working. You have to love you. I'd really love, there's a whole theme about loving the unlovable with the principle, which I really enjoyed.
That was cool. Yeah.
And then some of this, we're connected in ways that you don't even know and stuff. But some of that pushes into a little past Christianity, into a sort of mumbo jumbo area.
I think for me, the problem is I can understand some of those ideas on a theological level. I think C.S. Lewis has pointed out that in some ways the mystic isn't wrong in terms of because God is everywhere in everything.
Yeah.
They just have some of the details messed up. Because this was, in some ways, this sort of felt like L'Engle's take on the space trilogy, like Lewis's
Kinda.
space trilogy, where you take some theological ideas in a sci-fi setting.
Yeah.
But here it was hard to distinguish between the weird rules of this fantasy scenario she's setting up and her actual theology behind it.
I can see that. Yeah.
It was a weird Gordian knot to untangle.
And it is. I won't argue that. So, would you recommend this, Tim?
I will leave the listener to decide, depending on our conversation. If you like something super out there, I mean, and it was certainly original. I mean, I will certainly give it credit for that. In our world of like story saturated stuff where we've heard of a lot of different.
It's nothing like anything else.
No. So
I would say if you liked Wrinkle in Time, I'd give it a try. You might. It's not the same thing, but it's perpendicular. It's tangential to it. Is that the right way to say it? It's related. It's
related somehow.
It's related. It's sideways to it.
Again, points for originality at the very least. All right. So after that was The Emperor's Soul.
Yeah, and you read this one too.
I did. This was my first Brandon Sanderson.
Nice novella here.
Yes, and I know you've read a lot of his long books.
A lot of his long. I never read anything short by him, so this was interesting. I did really enjoy this.
This was kind of a novella length. We compared it. It did remind me a lot of like a Children of the Wells length.
It's about that like 30,000 words or something maybe. 30,
and honestly, I couldn't help but think of our long lost Kalia book that is still in progress, because this is another story that's about a woman, an expert at something that is toiling over a very specific situation. Basically, you said Natasha read it, and
and she says basically the entire book's there to explain this magic system, she's not wrong.
As if the author had this one magic system idea that he really wanted to get out there, so he wrote a novella about it.
So basically, they make stamps that can rewrite the history of anything. Basically, like a table, like you can say, oh, wait, it actually was always kept up instead of falling into disuse, and then becomes a nice looking table.
It reminded me a lot of alchemy from Full Metal Alchemist in terms of like, you get a vague sense of how this works, but not like where the actual energy so you draw the circle on a thing and it suddenly it transforms into something else by magic stuff.
Just the world works that way. Yeah, but the general idea is that you got to know something super well to know the history of it, and then you can change small things in its history, like basically rewrite what happened to it. So over the course of the book, she like remakes her room, which is like this pit, into this like lavish, luxurious room, just by, like figuring out, oh, look, there's a leak here, but it could have been over there. And then
they use a better kind of wood, or whoever carved this decided to add some flourishes.
Yeah.
So anyway, but I mean, this was a prison cell that she was in,
Yeah.
and then she transformed it into a most luxurious room in the palace.
But the main job she's doing is that the emperor of this country is basically comatose.
Yeah, he's in a vegetable
State from an assassin. And she's been charged to rewrite his soul, to basically copy it.
Based on, she has to do lots of study about the emperor's life, figure out who he was, and then make this soul that will not actually be his soul, but would act just like it.
It basically, it'll rewrite, it'll stamp on top of him, and so that he's not vegetable anymore.
Yeah. And she's basically in a hard place because she was caught stealing something from the palace, and the people who are in charge are, even though they don't approve of this kind of forging, they need her to do it so they can stay in power.
Yeah.
And so she's she's got a time limit. She's up again.
The time limit works really well for this novella.
It really does.
Yeah.
So I found this really fun, quick read.
It was a really fun, quick read. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it was interesting. There's this neat, interesting conversation between her and one of the people she's working for, one of the only good people.
And he was an interesting character.
He's an interesting character, and interesting discussion between. He was like, "You're such a good forger. Why not just make this stuff? Why not make your own art?" And she was like, "Well, this is art because I'm putting all this work into it. Dang it!"
Yeah, it's like between what's the use of imitation and art and all the so those things are kind of in the background, sort of adding flavor to.
And in true postmodern style, I feel like he doesn't really necessarily come down on any one thing, but he poses a lot of interesting questions, and on her end of things, it's interesting to think about how she's basically forced, because she needs to be able to work with this guy, she's basically forced to be authentic with him, which is interesting because her work involves basically lying about creating falsehoods, and yet she also has to be true to another person.
The best lie is the one that's mostly true.
Yeah, which I don't know. Again, lots of interesting ideas.
Well, lots
in
of
there.
little interesting ideas, lots of questions. My minor complaint was that I kind of wish some of those ideas would have been delved into more, but it's not really the place in this book. It's just sort of a thing like, oh, I wish we would have had more. That's more my personal like deal. If you ever read, let's say, Remnant of Dreams, sort of thing. So.
I recommend it. It was
Yeah,
nice
I would
first
recommend if you never read Sanderson or you just like fantasy and you want a quick read. There's no reason not to read it.
Yeah, it was a nice introduction to Sanderson for me. Mm-hmm. Okay, so finally, this is the first time I missed doing. We have this tradition of doing a Dickens short story, one of his holiday short stories in December.
This was the fourth one. Yeah,
this is the fourth one, and I missed this one. What was it called?
The Battle of Life.
Okay, and what was it about?
It's basically about. It's very down to earth, as it is like there's no supernatural elements or ghosts or anything. Basically, the sister's engaged with this guy, and then she runs off, and then kind of the aftermath, not with him, with someone else.
Okay.
And the aftermath of that, and then she comes back, and all is well. So, because Dickens is a happy ending. First off, I got to mention, as always, I love Dickens' writing, and I love his characters. The takeaway best is Snitch and Craggy.
Okay.
They're the lawyers. It's Snitch and Craggy Incorporated, or whatever. And they go together everywhere, and they finish up. Craggy doesn't talk much, but Snitchy. It's Snitching Crags.
Okay.
And they're fabulous. But there's also Clemency, who's super clumsy, and but anyways, the two and the father, who's like, oh, life's just a joke. There's nothing serious in life. Everything's just a joke, which I think is just a very interesting. That's like a philosophy nowadays, and this is like from but he learns that it's not, because then his daughter runs away and he becomes sorrow makes him find things more meaningful.
Interesting.
But what I'm also especially fascinated with Dickens, besides his characters and his writing and everything like that, is in 3 sections, I think, like 3 days, about a year apart from each other.
Okay.
Or no, a year and then like a couple more years later. Anyways, but they're all like the same day, but years apart.
Okay.
Is his ability to write about goodness. Like these two sisters like deeply care for each other. Mm-hmm. And like you don't feel, well, I didn't feel like it was forced or fake, but it's just like the ending, you realize that the one sister ran away not because she was trying to hurt anyone, but because she knew that her sister was really in love with her, with the one that she was going to marry. But she would never said it because they were both super self-sacrificing to each other. Mm-hmm. And just to have that illustrated and talked out and spread, not just as a moment, but as like an entire drawn out conclusion, this sort of like all these people who basically learn to like sacrifice for each other is a fascinating thing. Mm-hmm. And Dickens does it really well, I think. It was much more like last year's book than the two before.
Okay. Last year we did A Cricket on the Hearth.
Yeah.
Did this one take place during any holiday?
It was in the winter at one point, and
okay.
I think they mentioned New Year's, but I mean not particularly.
Okay.
No.
Yeah, these holiday Christmas, December, I think it's more by theme than
yeah, and they might just come out every Christmas. I don't know, but I really enjoyed it. I'm like, why have more people not read this? Again, this is more low key. It's not as fantastical as some of his stuff, or even as overblown as some of his other characters.
Okay,
but I really enjoyed it. Yeah,
cool. All right, well, those were our book club books. Did we miss anything?
Not right now.
Awesome.
So I hear some alarms going off.
Man, that's a lot of alarms.
It doesn't like
almost end of the world sort of sounding. I hope the
podcast. Let's get out here quick.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good idea. Assuming we survive the end of the world here, be sure to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify.
Yes, you can always visit us at derailedtrainsofthought.blogspot.com or email us at derailedtrains@gmail.com.
And we are also on Facebook and Twitter if you care to follow us on either of those things, although we have been very lax in doing anything over there.
We are there, and that is about it. All right, Tim, so what is your soundtrack for today?
Okay, for my soundtrack, you can go with almost anything for video games for soundtrack because they all get overanalyzed somewhere on the internet. And as we said before, some stories kind of invite you to overthink it because they overthink things. And one of those series would be Kingdom Hearts.
What?
Yes. So I've got a song cover from Kingdom Hearts 3. This is a cover of the song Don't Think Twice.
Oh, I like it.
Which, again, a name that fits with us. This is a violin cover by Luna Lorraine that has the backing instrumental music is by The Right Step. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes. So I hope you enjoy it. And until next time, we probably need to get out of here.
Yes.
Until next time, this is Tim.
This is Nick.
Bye-bye.